Hi everybody, Mark from I'm with the Band, where we definitely play guitars and other instruments, and we pet dogs, and you cannot do too much of that these days. Welcome to our deep dive into the blues. We're going to cover a lot of great information here, and maybe some things that you've never heard before. How you can use pentatonics in certain very specific ways, what that really means, where it comes from, how does it work. I'm going to say some things that may actually and bring some concepts in that may be slightly controversial. But what I am going to do definitely for sure is to cover this in a way that no matter what your experience level is, you can grab something from this. You can take something away from this. So I'm going to dive in here. We're going to build it step by step, and we're going to start right now. Right, before I do that though, I want to give you a rundown of all the different sections and what I'm going to cover in those sections coming up. As I referenced, I'm going to talk about initially here blues progressions, chords, pentatonic scales, how that all works, where it comes from. I have mentioned a little bit about modes and some things that I'm going to bring into that discussion. Just trust me though, I'm not going deep into modal theory and how modes work against different chords so much as it is how is it that pentatonic scales work against the chords that we use in blues. That's really what I'm going to focus on here. That is going to lead directly into another section on tension and release, another important concept in blues that really give blues the emotional quality that it has. So that's going to focus on that, but it also builds out of the information from the previous section. Similarly, my next section is going to be on call and response, another key concept in blues. I'm going to talk about that from two different standpoints. One is the standpoint of just how things work in terms of blues songs, how, you know, when you have several sections in a blues song, there is a call and there is a response and how that all works together. And then I'm also going to talk about soloing just a little bit, and I'm going to dive into themes and call and responses as it relates to doing solos so that they're structured in a way that really makes sense. That is going to lead directly into a conversation about blues forms, the mysteries of bars. What's a bar? What's a straight 12? What is a fast to the 4/12? What is an 8 bar? 16 bar. I mean, those are all things that happen in blues songs. What is that? What does it mean? How does it sound? How do the progressions work? All those sorts of things, which is going to lead directly into a section on terminology and blues language. There is a language that we have in the blues world that I'm going to come back to and talk about in video 2 also at the very end there when I'm going to cover another topic. But in this case, really what I'm looking at is all of the different terms that are important to know if you were going to play this music. What's a head? What's a bar? What's a turnaround? How does that all work? And I'm going to do some demonstrations of all those things and clarify a lot of questions that I get. I think really true that there's a lot of people that are playing blues but really don't understand some of these basic things, and this whole series is designed to help both the beginner and the more experienced player that's just trying to get a better handle on what's going on in this world. And it is a world, and it's an art form, and it's all of those things. But let's dive in here and talk about what the blues is, how these silly pentatonic scales work, chord progressions, all that stuff happens right now. Okay, to start with, blues is a modal or mode-based musical form. Now that may be scary a little bit, and that may be something different than what you might have heard before, but it differs from standard Western diatonic music in a number of ways. both in terms of harmony and the kinds of sounds that are there predominant in your tonic, subdominant, and dominant. I'll talk about what those are, chords, and other chords. And also in terms of progressions. The progressions are different. And I'm going to present and show you what I mean by that in a minute in terms of how standard progressions operate and how blues progressions differ. The other thing I want to say is the scalar mode in a song actually will determine what that chord progression is. And there are lots of variations and options across the genre. There are chord progressions that have all major thirds in all the chords and dominant 7 sounds in all of those chords, even though they are major. If you don't know what that is, I'm going to explain that in the next section. There are blues progressions that are all minor. The 1, the 4, and the 5 chords are all minor. But there are also exceptions to that based on what the scale or mode is that the song is based around. You could have a 1 minor and a 4 and a 5 major, or you have songs that are 1 minor, 4 minor, and 5 major. There really is that kind of differences here, and I'm going to repeat this a number of times through the things that we're doing. The key to understanding that really is to be learning songs, learning classic songs, and understanding the genre from that standpoint. And something I'm going to repeat through this whole series here several times. One thing that I want to tell you, though, too, is that I am not going to focus on application, at least during this series, application of modes or other scales to play across chord progressions. Not right now. I'm going to simply talk about modes from the standpoint of how modes become the foundation for major and minor pentatonics. They can work across several chords and actually keys in progressions. So that is really what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus on the basics. So if you go, oh God, I heard that word mode and that scares me right now, no worries. What I'm really going to do is focus a lot on how those pentatonic scales actually do work and why. So what are those notes? Why do some notes sound good against some of the chords and maybe not so good against others, or maybe sound different against others? And I'm going to walk through that in detail in the next section. Okay, you may have already heard of and understand this concept of 1, 4, and 5 chords within a chord progression. You may have heard it before. If you're experienced at playing blues, you certainly have. Here's where this all comes from, and I think it's an important thing to understand, because I already said that blues differs from standard Western musical forms in a number of ways. All right, so this is the standard way that chord progressions operate in standard Western music. We have, and these are intervals and notes in a major scale. The do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do sound that we all have heard. So typically, you'll notice that in that progression, there are chords and modes that go with each one of those intervals in a major scale and a minor scale, but as I said earlier, we're really focusing right now on major progressions. We'll come later to talk a little bit more about minor progressions. So in this typical way that we do things in Western music, the 1 would be major. The chord that is associated with the first note and 4th and 5th notes in that progression. So we have 1, that is 1. We have 4, which in this case, in Western music, typically is also major. So major meaning it is It is the first note in the scale, the major third in the scale, and the 5 in the scale. All right? And then we have the fifth note in the scale and the fifth chord, which is in Western music typically a 5/7. And it has that sound. Now, that sound may be familiar because that is the sound that we typically have in most chords in blues music. So we typically have our 1, our 4, and our 5 all built on that whole concept, which is why it is sometimes very useful to think about us when we're playing blues songs of really playing in 3 different keys. So we have A, D, and E in the key of A. Or, as I said, we can think in terms of 3 different keys for this reason. As I said, that fifth note in the scale is the only one that actually has this bluesy sound to it, that flatted seventh sound. Where that comes from is this. And this is where the whole idea of modes comes in here. The fifth mode in Western music, that fifth sound, that 5/7 sound, is this. Here is the standard major scale again. So there's a half step between the seventh note in the scale and the root an octave up. In blues, the sound that we are using is this sound. So it is now that flatted seventh sound, so in other words, the seventh note in a major scale lowered a half step to what we call the flatted seventh, or sometimes it's referred to as the dominant 7, just because the way that sound does dominate pretty significantly. Those dominant 7 sounds are in the 1, the 4, and the 5 in blues music. And sometimes, because of certain progressions, we have a 2, the second note in the scale. In this case, it would also be the same with that flatted 7th sound or a substitution thereof. And I'm not going to dive into that, but there are ways that you can substitute other chords for those main chords, those flat 7 chords. But 2 to 5 is a way that you hear it in some songs. All right, so knowing that, and we also look at this standard way, we see that fifth mode that is associated with the fifth chord, then the fifth note in the scale, is what's called a mixolydian mode. And that mixolydian mode is this sound. So it is a major scale with that flatted 7th sound. And here is where we start moving into the question of pentatonics and what pentatonics are and why they work. If we take those modes from all 3 of those keys and we play them, then we go to the 4 and the 5, and we look at all of the notes that are common between those 3 chords. We end up with 3 key notes, well, really 5. So let's focus on the minor pentatonic first. Within the minor pentatonic scale, out of the 5 notes that are in that scale, there are 3 notes that are in common between every single one of those chords, right? And that is A, E, and D. All right, those are in all 3 of those chords. And then we have 2 other notes. We have an F sharp, okay, so that F sharp sound, and a B. And interestingly, those notes also are key parts of major pentatonic scales. So the major pentatonic sound comes from those. And then we have some outliers, and really not outliers, but they are what we call passing tones. Out of that 5-note scale, that pentatonic scale. So that's 2 octaves of that pentatonic scale that most of us know. The other two notes, so we've got those three that are in common between every single one of those chords, between the 1, 4, and the 5. We also have two notes that are common. In this case, we have G. All right, so we have that G note, which is common between two of those chords, and in fact is the flatted seventh for the A chord. All right, so it's that important in these chord progressions. And we have a C note. Now, in this major scale, actually in that major mode, that A major mixolydian mode, there is no C there in the A. That is actually the flatted third, so the minor third. And I'm going to come back to that because that is going to be something that I'm also going to give another name to. So you can hear that note and how it kind of clashes a little bit with that sound of that A7 chord. And there are things that blues players typically will do with that to sort of alleviate some of that tension. The next section is going to be on this concept of tension and release, a key aspect of playing blues. But hear this. So when we go to the 4 chord, now that sound is not outside at all, and in fact, that C sound, that minor third in A, when we go to the D7 sound, is actually your flatted seventh. So hear how that sounds against the A again, and now, so that's how it sounds against the A. And now here's how it sounds against the D. It actually is a part of the chord. So that is what we call a passing tone. It is also something else. That C note is what I call a tension trigger. So we already have a certain amount of tension that is already built into these chords. And when I start the next section, I'm going to focus entirely on this. Just by the sake of the fact that we have this major third sound played against the flatted seventh sound creates tension already, which makes that C note, that minor third, even though it is outside and it sounds kind of weird in a way, it creates additional tension. It is a tension trigger. And it is often played that way by classic blues players who will play that note against this and do different things with it. B.B. King did this a lot to sort of bend that up so it's almost a little bit closer to the major third, which in this case would be this note here. Okay, and that sound that we want to hear in our brains and hear in our ears, this is where the emotion and the tension comes from in blues. And I'm going to touch on that all in depth in the next. All right, tension and release is another key thing to understand in learning how to play the blues. We already, as I said in the last section, have tension that is built up just by the nature of the fact that we have this major third sound, that sound being played, okay, here it is up an octave, being played against that flatted seventh sound. In key of A right now, this is just a double stop that is just those two notes. It's the major third being played against the flatted seventh. Hear how there's already some dissonance there? So there is inherently tension. And what's happening so often in blues, especially as we are playing solos, is we are building that tension, easing it off, and that's where some of the emotion comes from. It comes from that tension and release. So as we move through these progressions, through these 3 main chords in many blues progressions, in the major blues progressions anyway, we have that sound against the 1 chord. We have that sound against the 4 chord. We have that sound against the the 5 chord and back to the 1. All right, so that is an important thing to understand. And then, as I said, we have this tension trigger. We have an additional tension note, which is in the 1 chord here, is that C. At least if we are playing with chords with major thirds in them. But we can use that, and it is a powerful thing. And if you listen, as I mentioned, I already mentioned B.B. King, a very important figure that really played a lot of major sounds in his playing, but he used that tension trigger, that minor third being pulled up a little bit to create some tension. And that is a really important thing to play around with as a player. All right, see how that sound works against those different chords. What can you do to sort of add tension or release tension by playing with that? I mean, this is another thing that typically happens. Here's a nice little lick that you typically hear. What that is really, I'm starting on that minor third again, adding it in the major third, and then going up to the nice thing that we like to hear resolved in our brains and our ears of that root note. So it comes back to the root note. But there are also other concepts here that are connected to this idea of tension and release. And one of them is a topic that people talk about a lot and really don't explain very much, and that is the idea of blues notes. And there are several different notes that sometimes are referred to blues note as blues notes. Sometimes people are referring to that flatted seventh sound as the blues sound, and that was what I first learned. That flatted seventh sound is different. It's added to chords in a way that we typically don't hear in Western music, and it is the blues sound. All right? Again, that blues sound played against that major third adds a certain amount of tension there. But there are other blues notes, and I've already talked about one that I've called the tension trigger, and that is that flatted third or that minor third played against major sounding chords. That is also very much of a blues note, the tension and emotion that comes from playing around with that and either bending it up or letting it sort of hang there in a way against chords where that is not typically part of the chord. The other note that is typically thought of and sometimes referred to as the blue note is the flatted fifth. And there is another mode, actually another pentatonic or actually 6-note scale. It is another scale that is a blues scale, and it is called the blues scale, and it is a pentatonic scale, but it adds a 6th note in, and that 6th note is that flatted fifth. All right, now that's a sound that we actually are familiar with. If you listen to players, there are players that milk that a lot. So here is that sound. Okay, so that sound, especially Chuck Berry, if you listen to Chuck Berry, that is a lick that he played in pretty much every Chuck Berry song. But what it is really is bending up to catch that blue sound or that flatted fifth sound. So think about that. Those are some things to add in as you begin playing around with tension and blue notes. What does that mean in terms of your playing and how you can approach things a little bit different to add more tension, release tension, and to create more interesting sounds as you play in the blues. The next concept I'm going to talk about here is something called call and response. And it is a key aspect of blues and blues structure, and also a key aspect of effective blues soloing. The idea of call and response certainly has historical roots, but in blues itself, in terms of the structure of the blues, It is a key thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a short progression. We're going to do one time around on a 12 bar with those dominant 7 chords. And I'm going to walk through what is called a straight 12. And I'm going to really dive into this idea of, well, what is a straight 12 bar blues? What is a bar? How do you know? And what are variations in the structure that you typically hear in blues music? And I'm going to sing with this, and I'm just going to kind of make up some words. But the key here is that I'm going to set up a call and a response, a call and a response. And then in the end, when I go to the 5 chord, I'm going to answer that, and I'm going to answer the question that was called back and forth and responded to. And that is a key thing that happens many times in blues songs. All right, so here is my... I said I love my baby. 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 She does good things for me. So what you heard is that I repeated that phrase, and you will hear that many times in blues songs where there will be a call. And sometimes it's answered right away. Somebody will say, "You love your baby? Cool. All right, what does that mean?" "Well, I love my baby." "All right, well, what does that really mean?" "Well, I love my baby because she does good things for me." So that call and response idea is certainly there. All right, so the other way that call and response works in blues is that very often in solos, you are setting up a call and response back and forth sort of thing. So I may build that actually off of a theme or a head, which comes out of the jazz world, that I will build upon as I play my solo. So here's again, I'm going to go back to this whole thing of why it's important to learn songs. And when you learn songs, you will learn that. And that is a key aspect of blues, a key aspect of being a good player. And if you are playing in bands, these are the things that you need to know. As a player, I will also, even if I'm just playing a straight 12 bar that doesn't, over a straight 12 bar that doesn't necessarily have a theme built in, I will still build a certain amount of tension. We go back to that concept. By playing around with this idea of call and response. So as an example, again, still in the key of A, I'm going to set up a theme. All right, I'm going to answer it. Right, so what I did there again is I set up a call. I responded to it and I changed it maybe a little bit. Then I responded again, and this time I maybe began in the same place, but I added something a little bit extra to it. And in the end, just like I did when I was singing the verses and doing the call and response idea there, I told you more to the story, which is really what you're doing when you're playing, either playing a song, playing a good blues song, you're telling a story, and when you're playing a good solo, there should be a story behind it as well. So that is what really differentiates between just sort of noodling over a 12-bar progression and actually setting up the story. And the story involves some tension and release, and as I said, call and response. So that is the next really important thing that you need to know in order to become a good blues player. Okay, the next aspect of this, the next key thing I'm going to focus on is going to be blues structure. And I've already introduced this a little bit. I have talked about something called a straight 12. And I'm gonna play through something like that here right now again. But I'm going to also do this with the idea that we're setting this up and understanding that this is not the only way that blues songs can be structured. There are straight 12 blues songs. That is definitely the case. And there are blues songs that do something called going fast to the 4. So going fast to our 4 chord, returning to the 1, and going to the 4 chord again in the typical place in a straight 12 where it would typically be. The other thing that you will hear about is a couple of different forms of 8-bar blues. So there are 8-bar blues that follow one format, and there are standard 8 bars that follow a slightly different format. And there are songs that actually have a 16-bar verse, an 8-bar chorus, and straight 12s underneath the solos. So all those things are there present in the genre. And again, when I do my video on 10 songs everybody needs to know, those are the songs that I'm gonna focus on, are the songs that introduce those ideas and that concepts. I also want to say, though, this idea of having a set structure of bars or measures per chord, and being able to say that this is a 12-bar blues progression is a relatively new thing. If you listen to the older school players, some of them did not follow those formats. And one example is John Lee Hooker. I had a friend that played with John Lee Hooker, and he said the biggest challenge of playing with John Lee, aside from the fact that he was slightly cantankerous at sometimes, is that he changed chords when he darn well felt like it. To him, that was a part of the emotion and the tension, is that he changed chords when he felt like they needed to be changed. And that, again, is a very old school way of approaching things. It's not the way that we understand things today, but it is the way that it was often done in the past. We have, though, come to understand that a 12-bar blues is built in a certain way today, that an 8-bar blues is built in a certain way today, and we have come to sort of understand that form as being a form that is standard within the blues genre. I'm going to talk about how this it works and what the exceptions are, and I'm going to do that here. All right, I've already given you one example of a straight 12-bar blues, but I'm going to do it again, and this time I'm going to talk about what we mean by bars. And again, I don't want to assume anything. What we are really talking about here are measures of time. So in this case, we are subdividing measures into specific groups. In this case, I'm doing 4/4 time, which means that that top number is the number of a number of counts per measure, or the number of counts per bar. You hear people refer to those two terms interchangeably. The bottom note tells you how it is subdivided and what note or what note value we are talking about here. In this case, it is subdivided into 4 parts, each measure, and the quarter note, that bottom number is referring to a quarter note, is the count. That's what the count is on. We have a 6/8 and 12/8. So in other words, it's the 8th note is what we are counting, and there are 12 or 6 counts per measure. So in other words, this kind of in threes or triplets. So I'll walk through that in a second as well. But right now, let's go through what an actual straight 12 is. Everybody needs to know that. And I will have something up here that will show you exactly what that looks like in terms of where the changes take place in a standard straight 12. So I'm going to count the measures. So I'm going to start 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2, 2, 3, 4. 3, 2, 3, 4. 4, 2, 3. 7, 2, 3, 4, 8, 2, 3, 4, 9, 2, 3, 4, 10, 2, 3, 4, 11, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. So back half of the 12th bar, the 12th measure, is usually what we refer to as the turnaround. It's where we go back to the 5, sometimes, not all the time. Some songs don't do that, and that's why it is also important to learn songs. But that is typically the way that the chords change and progressions work in what we refer to as a straight 12 in blues. Now, as I said, we have these 6/8 or 12/8 feels too, and we have okay, so 2/4 kind of country feels. And as I'll talk about in another section in an upcoming video, we also have Latin grooves as well. So rumbas typically are something that you hear a lot in many blues songs. All right, so I want to talk about the concept of going fast to the 4. Here's a song that is 12/8. Stormy Monday is one. Call me Stormy Monday, and it goes fast to the 4. Here, Tuesday's just as bad. Now it goes to the 4 in the normal place. Call Stormy Monday, Tuesday's just as bad. All right, so that is fast to the 4. So in other words, on that second measure, it actually goes to the 4 chord. So again, I will put that up, and if you want a hard copy of this or want an email copy, go to the website. The link will be down in the description below, and I can send you a copy of exactly how these formats all work. All right, so we also have certain songs that are 8-bar blues, and I'm going to give you 2 forms that are 8-bar blues. One is a song called Key to the Highway. Key, you got the key to the highway, so it goes to the 5, 2, 4. And I'm running down that road, gonna leave here running. Talking's much too slow. Going back, so that's an 8-bar, 1 8-bar. So within that form, that song, that is an 8-bar blues. That is one form of an 8-bar blues. Also have a song called Dimples, which is also an 8-bar blues, which follows a slightly different format though. And it works like this. Okay, so it's also a classic riff that you may want to learn. I first heard it by the Allman Brothers. I know that it's not an Allman Brothers song, but it's something you may want to check out. And it goes like this. So that's another 8-bar form. We also, there are 16 bars, as I mentioned before, songs, and especially verses. There's 16 bars with a stop, and that kind of term is a really important thing to understand. Stops are literally what it means. It's a place in the song where it stops, and there are certain songs that have key stops in maybe one time in the 3rd verse, as one example I can think of, or a song that I will have as part of my top 10 songs that all blues players need to know, that has a stop always in the verse at a special place, and that is a 16-bar verse. So these are key things to know and key things to build on, and I will go to the next concept here in a bit. So there's a couple of other concepts that I really want to focus on here, and I want to kind of wrap things up by doing this. I've talked about some things, some words and some terms, some things that you need to know, and I want to clarify some things around that. One of them is turnarounds, and the idea of turnarounds. So there's lots of different turnarounds. There's one that I've already done. So what you're doing is you're coming from the you're walking back down to get to your one chord. All right, so that's a way of doing it. Here's another way. I'm walking back down to get to that. Is another way that you can do it. Here's another reason why you learn songs is that sometimes there are turnarounds that are unique to songs. There are certainly turnarounds that are unique to players. Certain players that usually always do the same kind of turnaround. This is an aspect of learning the vocabulary of the genre, is to learn how these things work. And the more songs you learn, the more things you add to your vocabulary. Another concept that I have introduced and talked about is that whole idea of playing by numbers. This is something I'm going to come back to in the next video at the very end when I start talking about playing in bands, because songs will be introduced this way. They will use the numbers idea and say this as an example. Here's a song that begins on the 5, walks down to the 4. At every turnaround, there's this same way that it happens, and there's a stop, and there will be a stop in the 3rd verse. Watch for me, I'll signal it. And they will use, and we'll talk about the groove, which is the thing that I'm going to really touch on in the next video. This is a 6/8 blues, and it goes fast to the 4. And there's a stop on the 3rd verse. I'm just giving you some examples of how a song might be called out on the bandstand. I also have talked about the concept of themes or heads. Here's a song that begins with a theme. It is T-Bone Walker's song, T-Bone Shuffle. So there's actually a head, and that theme starts the song before the first verse and is usually repeated again before you go into the solos. That's a great example. Another one is a Little Walter song, usually played on harmonica. This is. So again, that the whole song is built off of that theme, and you may build your solos off the theme as well. So it's important to understand those concepts. I'm going to really return to this and really talk about this in terms of application, certainly in the 3rd video, where I'm going to look hard at actual songs. And how they're structured and unique qualities to those songs. So as I said, you learn songs, you build your vocabulary, and that is a key thing for learning this genre. I've repeated this over and over again. The genre is in the songs. And I'm certainly going to say that again as we move along. Video number 2 will be heavily on grooves and groove applications and actually playing in bands and applying these principles. So stick around. All right, well, this concludes video 1. I hope there's been some enlightening and interesting things, or at the very least something that's made you think a little bit. And I'd love to know exactly what thoughts are, or more importantly, is there more information that you're looking for on any of these concepts I've covered here. We will move into video number 2 here real soon, And video number 2 will definitely cover some of the aspects that I hinted at, but I'm going to expand upon. Primarily in that video, it's going to be focused on grooves, and I'm going to give examples. I'm going to talk about how to play certain rhythms in blues that are very, very common, and you will hear every blues band do. I'm going to focus a lot on shuffle grooves. I'm actually going to talk about how to play it, what works, give several examples, play an example, and then we'll focus on some of the other grooves that are out there. And I'm going to actually play along with them, and give you some typical, maybe little rhythm figures that a guitar player, rhythm guitar player might use against those particular grooves. Not that that's the only way to do it. I'll even do some variations on a couple things, but we will do that. Also, the last part of that video will be focused on playing in bands, what that's like, what's it like to be in a blues band, how are songs introduced, what happens on the bandstand, who is in charge of things. If things are kind of free form in many ways, how does that work? And that is sometimes true. But I'll explain all that, dive into that. Video number 3 will be on 10 songs that every blues musician needs to know. And they either have specific grooves, specific structures, unique qualities like a unique head, or a way that they start, or all that. And I'll explain that at that time. I just wanted to introduce that, and also remember, subscribe so that you stay in touch with us, and we can let you know when we have videos. These aren't the only things we do, and not the only genre I'm going to focus on. I'm just doing blues right now because it's something that has been requested, and I've got students that are asking for more details and more information, and thought that others might be interested as well. So we will see you soon. Check out all the links down below, and yep, we got more coming up.